Imagine standing on a hilltop. The wind is dry, the sun hammers the pale limestone beneath your feet. Before you stretches a city unlike any other on earth, a place where the stones themselves seem to breathe memory, where every crack in the ancient walls holds the echo of prayers spoken in a dozen languages across 100 generations. Below you, the valleys carve deep into the earth like scars that will never fully heal. Above you, domes of gold and silver catch the light of the same sun that shone over kings, prophets, conquerors, and refugees for more than 3,000 years. This is Jerusalem, not simply a city, not merely a place on a map. Jerusalem is the beating heart of human civilization's most desperate longing. The longing for something permanent in a world that is always changing. For something sacred in a world that is always burning, and it has been burning. More than any other city in recorded history, Jerusalem has been besieged, conquered, destroyed, rebuilt, desecrated, and restored. Archaeologists estimate that the city has been destroyed at least twice, besieged more than 20 times, attacked 52 times, captured and recaptured 44 times. Every empire that ever rose in the ancient world, Egypt, Assyria, Babylon, Persia, Greece, Rome, every one of them had Jerusalem on its list. Every general who ever dreamed of controlling the crossroads of the known world pointed his armies toward this hill. But here is what no military textbook will ever fully explain. Why? Why does this particular hill matter so much? Why has this city perched on a ridge in the middle of a land with no river access, no major port, no vast agricultural plain, no obvious strategic advantage that geography alone could justify? Why has this city been the most contested piece of real estate in the history of the human race? The answer is not political. It is not purely military. The answer runs deeper than empire and dynasty and the cold calculations of power. The answer is sacred. Jerusalem sits at the crossroads of three of the world's great monotheistic faiths: Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. It is the city where Abraham, according to Genesis 22, climbed a mountain called Moriah and prepared to offer his son, trusting a God who would provide. It is the city where David, the shepherd who became a king, danced before the Ark of the Covenant and wept before the God who knew his name. It is the city where Solomon built the most magnificent temple the ancient world had ever seen. A house of gold and cedar and carved cherubim, where the presence of the Lord descended in a cloud so thick that the priests could not stand to minister. It is the city where prophets walked the streets and cried out for justice, where Isaiah saw the Lord sitting high and lifted up and the train of his robe filling the temple. It is the city where Jeremiah wept as the armies of Babylon tore down those very walls. It is the city where, centuries later, Jesus of Nazareth walked into that same temple complex, overturned the money changers' tables, looked out over the city from the Mount of Olives, and wept, yes, wept, saying in Luke 19:41-42, "If you, even you, and had only known on this day what would bring you peace, but now it is hidden from your eyes." And it is the city where, in the 7th century of the Common Era, the Prophet Muhammad is said to have ascended to heaven from the rock that still stands inside the Dome of the Gold. The weight of that history does not sit lightly on those stones. So today we are going to walk through it all. We are going to follow Jerusalem from its very first appearance in the pages of Scripture, through the rise and fall of David's kingdom, through the catastrophe of the Babylonian exile, through the silence of the centuries between the Testaments, through the Roman occupation, through the destruction of 70 AD, and into the echoes that still reverberate in our world today. This is not a quick survey. This is the full story, and the blood, the faith, the fire, and the extraordinary thread of divine purpose that runs through every era of this city's impossible life. Get comfortable, because the story of Jerusalem is the story of everything that matters. Before the walls rose, before the towers were built, before any of the great kings arrived to claim this ridge as their own, there was a hill. The hill the Bible calls Moriah, a bare limestone outcropping on the edge of the Judean highlands, sitting at roughly 2,500 feet above sea level, flanked on the east by the Kidron Valley and on the west and south by the Valley of Hinnom, the deep ravine that would one day give us the word Gehenna itself, a name synonymous with destruction and fire. Geographically, this location makes a kind of defiant sense. The ridge sits at the junction of major ancient trade routes, north to south. The Ridge Road connected Egypt to Mesopotamia. East to west, the passes through the Judean hills connected the Mediterranean coast to the Jordan River Valley and beyond. Whoever controlled this particular hill controlled movement through this entire corridor. And yet, as any general looking at a topographical map would quickly note, it is not an easy position to hold. The valleys on three sides make approach difficult, but also make resupply during a siege nearly impossible. Water was always the problem. The Gihon Spring, tucked into the Kidron Valley below the city's eastern wall, was Jerusalem's lifeline. And its vulnerability. Control the spring, and you control the city. This strategic reality shaped nearly every major siege the city ever endured. The first time Jerusalem appears by name in the Bible, it is not called Jerusalem at all. In Genesis 14:18, we meet a mysterious figure named Melchizedek, who is described as the king of Salem and the priest of God Most High. He brings out bread and wine to Abram after Abram's victory in battle, and he blesses Abram in the name of El Elyon, God Most High, Salem, the Hebrew word for peace, shalom. And already, before the first stone of the first wall is laid, the city is being defined by its name's deepest meaning, a city of peace, which is, given everything that follows, one of history's most profound and painful ironies. Archaeologists have found evidence of settled occupation in the Jerusalem area dating back to the Chalcolithic period, roughly 4,500 to 3,500 BCE. The Bronze Age Canaanite city that occupied the site, known in Egyptian sources as Uru-Salam, was a modestly sized fortified town on a narrow ridge south of what would later become the Temple Mount. Excavations in the area of the city of David, led in the 20th century by archaeologists including Yigal Shiloh and later Eilat Mazar, have revealed extraordinary finds from this period. Massive stone walls, ancient water systems, and artifacts that tie this small hilltop settlement into the broader world of Late Bronze Age Canaan. By the time of the Late Bronze Age, around 1400 to 1200 BCE, Jerusalem appears in the Amarna letters, a collection of diplomatic correspondence between Egyptian pharaohs and Canaanite city kings found in Egypt in 1887. The king of Jerusalem, a man named Abdi-Heba, writes anxious letters to Pharaoh, warning of the approaching Hapiru, a term that some scholars have connected, though not without debate, to the Hebrews of the biblical narrative. Abdi-Heba pleads for Egyptian archers to defend his city. His letters carry the unmistakable tone of a man who knows that the world he has known is about to change forever. He was right. The Bible records in the book of Joshua that when the Israelites entered Canaan under Joshua's leadership, they fought a coalition of Canaanite kings, including Adoni-Zedek, the king of Jerusalem, who is mentioned in Joshua 10:1-3. The coalition was defeated and Adoni-Zedek was killed. But Jerusalem itself, the fortified city on that narrow ridge, was not taken. Not yet. The tribe of Judah made an initial attack and burned the city according to Judges 1:8. But the Jebusites who lived there could not be driven out, and for generations after that, according to Judges 1:21, the tribe of Benjamin failed to dislodge the Jebusites from their stronghold. Jerusalem remained a Jebusite enclave, a foreign city sitting in the middle of the land God had promised to Israel. a thorn that no one had yet managed to remove. Until David. David ben Jesse was born in Bethlehem, a small village in the Judean highlands, the youngest of 8 sons of a man named Jesse, a sheep farmer of no particular distinction. We know from 1 Samuel 16 that Samuel the prophet came to Jesse's house looking for the next king of Israel, and God passed over 7 impressive, strong, tall, older brothers to choose the one left out in the fields with the sheep. David was ruddy. We are told, probably meaning he had reddish hair or a reddish complexion, and had beautiful eyes. He was, from his earliest years, a poet and a musician. He played the harp well enough to be summoned to the court of King Saul to soothe the king's troubled spirit. He was also, from his earliest years, a warrior. The story of David and Goliath in 1 Samuel 17 is so embedded in the cultural consciousness that we sometimes forget how genuinely terrifying that confrontation must have been for everyone watching. A professional Philistine warrior, described as standing 6 cubits and a span, over 9 feet tall by the text's reckoning, though ancient Near Eastern hyperbole must be considered, versus a teenage shepherd with a sling and 5 smooth stones and an unshakable conviction that the armies of the living God were not going to lose to a man in bronze armor. David won. And from that moment, the trajectory of his life and the trajectory of Jerusalem's story was set. David's path to the throne was not a straight line. It was more like a road through a wilderness, winding, dangerous, full of ambushes and moments where the man who would be king was nearly broken entirely. After his victory over Goliath, David rose rapidly in Saul's estimation, and then just as rapidly became the object of Saul's obsessive, murderous jealousy. The women of Israel sang as the armies returned home. Saul has slain his thousands, and David his tens of thousands. A line from 1 Samuel 18:7 that seems innocent enough until you hear it through the ears of a king who was already wrestling with dark spiritual forces and a crumbling grip on his own sanity. Saul heard that song and something inside him shattered. The Bible says in 1 Samuel 18:9 that from that time on, Saul kept a close eye on David. That is the Bible's careful way of saying that a countdown had begun. Twice Saul hurled a spear at David while David was playing the harp in the king's house. Twice David stepped aside, and twice, one imagines, David felt the wind of that bronze-tipped shaft passing close enough to his face that he could hear it. He was probably 19 or 20 years old. He had done nothing wrong. He had served faithfully, fought bravely, loved Saul's son Jonathan with the fierce loyalty of a man who had never had a brother, and married Saul's daughter, Michal. And none of it was enough. The king wanted him dead. So David ran. He spent years in the wilderness, in the cave of Adullam, in the desert of Ziph, in the hills of En-Gedi, in the territory of the Philistines. He gathered around him a band of men described in 1 Samuel 22:2 as everyone who was in distress, everyone who was in debt, and everyone who was discontented, his mighty men, the misfits and the desperate and the overlooked, and he led them. He refused twice when the opportunity arose to kill Saul and end his own fugitive years. Once in a cave at En-Gedi, where Saul happened to go in to relieve himself, and David was hiding deep in the shadows. David crept close enough to cut off the corner of Saul's robe with his blade, and then his conscience struck him and he pulled back. He told his men in 1 Samuel 24:6, "The Lord forbid that I should do such a thing to my master, the Lord's anointed, to lay my hand on him, for he is the anointed of the Lord." It is one of the most striking moments of moral restraint in all of ancient literature. A man with every justification to kill his enemy, choosing instead to wait for God's timing. That restraint cost him years, but it also shaped his soul in ways that no victory could have. Saul died eventually, not at David's hand, but on the battlefield of Mount Gilboa. where the Philistines crushed the Israelite army and Saul, wounded by archers. I fell on his own sword rather than be taken captive. His sons, including the beloved Jonathan, died with him. When David heard the news, he did not celebrate. He mourned. The lament he composed for Saul and Jonathan, recorded in 2 Samuel 1, is one of the most heartbreaking pieces of poetry in the entire Bible. How the mighty have fallen! Tell it not in Gath, proclaim it not in the streets of Ashkelon, lest the daughters of the Philistines be glad. I grieve for you, Jonathan, my brother. You were very dear to me. Your love for me was wonderful, more wonderful than that of women. David was 30 years old when he was anointed king. He reigned first over only the tribe of Judah in Hebron for 7.5 years, while the rest of Israel rallied around Saul's surviving son, Ishbosheth. There was a long war between the two houses. It was not clean, it was not glorious. It was the messy, costly civil conflict that follows whenever power is contested. Assassinations, betrayals, shifting loyalties. Eventually, Ishbosheth was murdered by 2 of his own commanders, who brought his head to David expecting a reward. David had them executed instead. He was not the kind of king who celebrated the death of God's anointed, even his enemy. And after that, the elders of all Israel came to Hebron and made a covenant with David and anointed him king over all Israel. It was recorded in 2 Samuel 5:4-5. Now he needed a capital. Hebron was a Judean city. If David ruled from there, he would always be seen as a Judean king favoring his own tribe. He needed neutral ground. He needed a city that belonged to no single tribe. A city that could be claimed as the possession of the crown itself. And there, still sitting on its ancient ridge, still occupied by Jebusites who had never been defeated, despite all the years of Israelite settlement around them, was that fortified hilltop stronghold. The Jebusites called it Jebus. David called it a prize. The Jebusites themselves seem to have had some confidence in their defensive position. According to 2 Samuel 5:6, when David marched against them with his army, the Jebusites taunted him, "You will not get in here. Even the blind and the lame can ward you off." It was the kind of mockery that comes from behind very high walls. They believed their city was impregnable. They were wrong. The exact method by which David took the city has been debated by archaeologists and biblical scholars for generations. The text in 2 Samuel 5:8 mentions something called a tsinor, a Hebrew word that can mean a water shaft or conduit. Some scholars have connected this to the ancient Jebusite water shaft discovered during Warren's shaft excavations in the 19th century, a vertical shaft cut through the rock to allow access to the Gihon spring from inside the city walls. The theory is that David's commander Joab and a small force climbed up through this water shaft and opened the gates from within. Whether this is precisely what happened or whether the text means something different is still argued by experts. What is not argued is the result. The stronghold fell. David took it and named it the City of David. And according to 2 Samuel 5:9, David then took up residence in the fortress and called it the City of David. The ridge was approximately 11 acres at that time, small by any modern standard. But what David did with it would change the history of the world. He brought the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem. The Ark, the gold-covered acacia wood chest that housed the stone tablets of the 10 Commandments, Aaron's staff, and a jar of manna from the wilderness, was the most sacred object in Israelite religion. It was the symbol of God's covenant presence among his people. It had been captured by the Philistines, returned under terrible circumstances involving an outbreak of deadly plague among its captors, and had been sitting somewhat neglected in the house of a man named Abinadab in Kiriath Jearim for 20 years. David wanted it in his city. He wanted Jerusalem to be not just the political capital of a united kingdom, but the spiritual center of Israel's faith. He wanted the presence of God dwelling in the same place as the throne of the king. The first attempt to bring the ark to Jerusalem ended in catastrophe. The ark was placed on a new cart, a well-intentioned but incorrect approach, since the law specified it was to be carried on poles by Levites, not transported on a vehicle. When the oxen stumbled, a man named Uzzah reached out to steady the ark, and he died on the spot. The text of 2 Samuel 6:7 says, God struck him down because of his irreverent act. David was terrified and angry. He left the ark at the house of Obed-Edom the Gittite for 3 months. When he heard that the Lord was blessing that household, he tried again, this time correctly, with the Levites carrying it on their shoulders, with sacrifices being offered every 6 steps, and with David himself dancing before the Lord with all his might, wearing a linen ephod, leaping and spinning in the street, while the crowds cheered and the trumpets blew. His wife Michal watched from a window and despised him for it. She thought it was beneath his royal dignity. David told her in 2 Samuel 6:21-22 that he would become even more undignified than this, and that he would be humiliated in his own eyes, but that the slave girls she spoke of would hold him in honor. It is one of the raw, unguarded moments in David's story where we see not the ideal king, but the actual man, passionate, stubborn, completely undone by his love for the God he served. Michal had no children to the day of her death. The text notes, quietly, and the ark arrived in Jerusalem. David's dream was now clear. He would build a house for God. He was living in a palace of cedar, fine timber imported from Lebanon, the most prestigious building material of the ancient Near East, and the ark was dwelling in a tent. It struck him as wrong, as misaligned, as something that needed to be corrected. He told the prophet Nathan about his desire, and Nathan's initial response was enthusiastic. "Go ahead, do whatever you have in mind," Nathan said in 2 Samuel 7:3. "For the Lord is with you." But that night, God spoke to Nathan with a stunning reversal. "You will not build me a house," God said. "I will build you one." The passage that follows, 2 Samuel 7:8-17, is one of the most theologically significant passages in the entire Old Testament. God reminded David of everything he had done for him, taking him from the pasture, from following the flock, to be leader over Israel, cutting off all his enemies before him, making his name great, like the names of the greatest men on earth. God told David that a son of his would build the temple. But more than that, God made an extraordinary promise, that David's house and kingdom would endure forever before him, and that his throne would be established forever. This Davidic covenant became the theological foundation for the entire messianic hope of Israel. The promise of a king from David's line who would reign forever, a promise that the New Testament would argue was fulfilled not by any earthly son of David, but by Jesus of Nazareth, the son of David from Bethlehem, who was raised from the dead and seated at the right hand of God. But that is centuries away. For now, David sat before the Lord in 2 Samuel 7:18 and prayed one of the most humble prayers in Scripture. "Who am I, sovereign Lord, and what is my family that you have brought me this far?" The temple would be built by his son, but the preparations, the planning, the materials, the designs, those would be David's contribution. According to 1 Chronicles 22, David gathered vast quantities of materials, 100,000 talents of gold, 1,000,000 talents of silver, and quantities of bronze and iron too great to be weighed, along with cedar logs beyond number. He told his son Solomon in 1 Chronicles 22:14, "I have taken great pains to provide for the temple of the Lord 100,000 talents of gold, 1,000,000 talents of silver, yet quantities of bronze and iron too great to be weighed." He organized the Levites, the priests, the musicians, the gatekeepers. He drew up the architectural plans. He poured the energy of his entire kingdom into preparation for a building he would never see completed. And then came the great wound. The story of David and Bathsheba is told in 2 Samuel 11 with the spare, unflinching economy of the best biblical narrative. It begins with a sentence that has been called one of the most ominous in all of Scripture. In the spring, at the time when kings go off to war, David sent Joab out with the king's men and the whole Israelite army. But David remained in Jerusalem. He should have been with his army. He was not. He stayed home. And one evening he got up from his bed and walked on the roof of the palace, saying from the roof he saw a woman bathing, a beautiful woman, and he sent someone to find out about her. She was Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam and the wife of Uriah the Hittite, one of David's own elite warriors, one of his mighty men listed in 2 Samuel 23. A man of unswerving loyalty currently on the battlefield, serving the king who was about to destroy his life. David sent messengers to take Bathsheba. The text gives her no lines of dialogue in this scene. She came to him. He slept with her. She went home. Sometime later, she sent him a message. "I am pregnant." With those 3 words, the entire edifice of David's kingdom began to crack. David tried to cover it up. He called Uriah back from the battlefield and told him to go home to sleep with his wife, which would have provided a cover story for the pregnancy. But Uriah was too honorable. He refused to go home to sleep in his own bed, while the ark and the Israelite army were camping in the open fields. He slept at the entrance to the palace. David tried again, even getting Uriah drunk. Still, Uriah would not go home to his wife. His loyalty and integrity only made what David was about to do more monstrous. David sent Uriah back to the front with a letter to Joab. The letter was Uriah's own death warrant. David wrote in 2 Samuel 11:15, "Put Uriah out in front where the fighting is fiercest. Then withdraw from him so he will be struck down and die." Joab followed the orders. Uriah the Hittite was killed in battle. And after Bathsheba's period of mourning, David took her as his wife. The text of 2 Samuel 11 ends with a sentence that contains more moral weight in 7 words than most books carry in their entire contents. But the thing David had done displeased the Lord. God sent the prophet Nathan to David. Nathan came with a story, a parable about a rich man who had many sheep and flocks, and a poor man who had nothing except one little ewe lamb that he had raised like a daughter, that ate from his table and drank from his cup and slept in his arms. And when a traveler came to the rich man's house, the rich man refused to take from his own flocks to prepare a meal. Instead, he took the poor man's lamb. David heard the story, and his anger blazed. He declared that the rich man deserved to die. Man Nathan looked at him and said 4 words. 4 words that may be the most devastating words of personal confrontation in the entire Bible. "You are the man." 2 Samuel 12:7. The consequences came like stones falling. The child born of the affair would die. The sword would never depart from David's house. His own household would rise up against him. David's own son, Absalom, the most beautiful young man in all of Israel, the one David loved desperately, would one day lead a rebellion against his father, drive him from Jerusalem in humiliation, sleep openly with David's concubines on the palace roof in front of all Israel as a public declaration of dominance, and nearly take the kingdom by force. And it all unfolded exactly as promised. Solomon, the second child of David and Bathsheba, the one whose name means peace, the one whom God loved and named Jedediah, meaning beloved of the Lord, in 2 Samuel 12:25, would be the one to build the temple. But before Solomon could build anything, David had to live through years of catastrophe within his own family: the rape of his daughter Tamar by his son Amnon, the murder of Amnon by Absalom in revenge, Absalom's exile, his slow reconciliation with his father, his rebellion, his death at the hand of Joab, despite David's explicit orders to deal gently with the young man, and David's agonized cry when he heard the news, 2 Samuel 18:33, "Oh, my son Absalom, my son Absalom, if only I had died instead of you. Oh, Absalom, my son, my son." It is the cry of every father who has watched a beloved child destroy themselves. It transcends time and culture and religion. It is just a father breaking. David died old, worn out by it all, having charged Solomon to keep the ways of the Lord and to build the temple. And Solomon did. The construction of the first temple in Jerusalem, recorded in 1 Kings 6, began in the 4th year of Solomon's reign, approximately 966 BCE by most scholarly reckonings. It took 7 years to build. The dimensions were impressive, but not enormous by the standards of ancient Near Eastern temples. 60 cubits long, 20 cubits wide, 30 cubits high, roughly 90 by 30 by 45 feet. But the craftsmanship and the materials were extraordinary. Cedar beams from Lebanon, stone quarried and dressed away from the building site so that no hammer or chisel was heard at the temple site during construction, a detail that 1 Kings 6:7 notes with quiet reverence. Gold overlay on the inner sanctuary. Now 2 enormous golden cherubim, each 15 feet tall, wings spread to touch the walls on both sides of the Holy of Holies. The carved palm trees and open flowers on the walls. The bronze sea, a massive basin standing on 12 bronze bowls, used for ritual washing. The 10 golden lampstands, the table of showbread, the altar of incense. When the ark was brought into the Holy of Holies and the priests withdrew, the cloud of the Lord filled the temple. And the priests could not perform their service because of the cloud, for the glory of the Lord filled his temple. 1 Kings 8:10-11. Solomon stood before the altar and stretched out his hands toward heaven and prayed one of the great prayers of ancient literature, a prayer asking that this house would be a place where prayers were heard, and where foreigners who came from distant lands to pray would find a listening God, where Israel in captivity could turn and pray toward this city and find forgiveness, where the heavens would open and rain could fall, where armies could be turned back, where plagues could be stopped. For nearly 400 years, the first temple stood. Then Babylon came. Nebuchadnezzar II, king of Babylon, is described in the ancient sources and in the Bible as one of the most powerful rulers the ancient world had ever produced. He had already crushed the Assyrian Empire at the Battle of Carchemish in 605 BCE, effectively making Babylon the new superpower of the Near East. He marched his armies into Judah 3 times. The first deportation came around 605 BCE. Daniel and his 3 friends were among those taken to Babylon in this wave. The young men of royal and noble lineage selected for service in the Babylonian court. The second deportation came in 597 BCE, following a failed rebellion by King Jehoiakim's son Jehoiakim. This was when Ezekiel the prophet was taken to Babylon, along with the king and 10,000 of Jerusalem's craftsmen and warriors. And then came the third and final assault. In 586 BCE, after an 18-month siege that reduced Jerusalem to starvation, the Book of Lamentations describes mothers boiling their own children for food, a detail so terrible the mind almost refuses to process it. The Babylonian armies broke through the walls. King Zedekiah tried to flee. He was captured in the plains of Jericho, forced to watch as his sons were executed before his eyes and then blinded, the last sight he would ever see being the death of his children. He was bound in chains and taken to Babylon. The temple was stripped of its gold and bronze, every vessel carried off as plunder. Then, in the 5th month, the 7th day of the month, in the 19th year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign, a Babylonian official named Nebuzaradan came to Jerusalem and burned it. The temple, the palace, every great house. The walls were torn down. The city that David had built, that Solomon had glorified, was a smoking ruin. The prophet Jeremiah, who had spent decades warning that this day was coming and had been mocked, imprisoned, and thrown into a cistern for his trouble, sat among the ruins and composed the Book of Lamentations. It opens, "How deserted lies the city, once so full of people. How like a widow is she, who once was great among the nations. And she who was queen among the provinces has now become a slave." Jerusalem wept, and the exiles sat by the rivers of Babylon and wept with it. Psalm 137 records their grief. By the rivers of Babylon we sat and wept when we remembered Zion. There on the poplars we hung our harps, for there our captors asked us for songs. Our tormentors demanded songs of joy. They said, "Sing us one of the songs of Zion." How can we sing the songs of the Lord while in a foreign land? If I forget you, Jerusalem, may my right hand forget its skill. 50 years passed. The Persian Empire rose and swallowed Babylon whole. And in 539 BCE, the Persian king Cyrus the Great issued a decree, an extraordinary, unprecedented decree in the ancient world, allowing all the deported peoples in the Babylonian Empire to return to their homelands and rebuild their temples. The edict concerning Jerusalem and the Jewish people is recorded in Ezra 1:2-4, and it begins, "This is what Cyrus, king of Persia, says. The Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he has appointed me to build a temple for him at Jerusalem in Judah." The prophet Isaiah had predicted this by name, over a century before Cyrus was even born, in Isaiah 44:28 and 45:1, where God calls Cyrus his shepherd and his anointed, saying of Cyrus that he will fulfill all of God's purpose, and say of Jerusalem, "Let it be rebuilt," and of the temple, "Let its foundations be laid." The exiles returned, led by Zerubbabel, a grandson of the exiled King Jehoiakim, and by Jeshua, the high priest. A community of nearly 50,000 people made the long journey back from Babylon to the rubble of their former home. The book of Ezra records the return. The book of Nehemiah records the rebuilding of the walls under Nehemiah's leadership in the face of opposition from local governors who had grown comfortable with a ruined Jerusalem. The second temple was built, smaller, less glorious than the first, prompting those old men who remembered Solomon's temple to weep when they saw it, even as the younger generation shouted for joy at the laying of its foundation. Ezra 3:12-13. It was dedicated around 516 BCE. Jerusalem lived on. Then came the Greeks. Alexander the Great swept through the Levant in 332 BCE, and Jerusalem submitted without a fight. A legendary meeting between Alexander and the Jewish high priest at the gates of the city, recorded in the ancient Jewish historian Josephus, though not confirmed by other sources. Describes Alexander being shown the prophecy in Daniel that a Greek king would conquer Persia, and Alexander being so pleased that he offered the Jews favorable terms. Whether that story is historical or legendary, the practical result was that Jerusalem became part of the Hellenistic world. And for a generation or two, that was not entirely unwelcome. Many Jews adopted Greek language, Greek dress, Greek names, Greek philosophy. The Torah was translated into Greek, the Septuagint translation produced in Alexandria, Egypt, according to tradition by 72 Jewish scholars who all produced identical translations, a legend that speaks to the reverence with which this translation was received. But then the Seleucid king Antiochus IV, who gave himself the title Epiphanes, meaning God manifest, though his Jewish subjects called him Epimanes, meaning the madman, decided that the Jewish religion was an obstacle to his political goals of Hellenization, and he moved to eliminate it. In 167 BCE, he desecrated the Second Temple in Jerusalem by setting up an altar to Zeus on the altar of the Lord and sacrificing a pig on it. He banned circumcision, outlawed Sabbath observance, and ordered the Torah scrolls burned. This was the abomination of desolation that the prophet Daniel had predicted in Daniel 11:31, and it triggered one of the most dramatic military campaigns in Jewish history. A priest from the town of Modian named Mattathias, when ordered to offer a pagan sacrifice, refused, killed the Seleucid official who was enforcing the order, killed a fellow Jew who stepped forward to comply, and fled to the hills with his 5 sons. One of those sons was Judas Maccabeus, Judas the Hammer, and under his leadership, a small, outnumbered, outgunned band of Jewish guerrilla fighters somehow managed to defeat the armies of one of the most powerful empires in the world, recapture Jerusalem in 164 BCE, and purify and rededicate the temple. The 8-day celebration of that rededication is Hanukkah, the Festival of Lights, still celebrated by Jewish communities around the world today. But the independence of the Maccabean kingdom was fragile and brief. By 63 BCE, Rome had arrived. The Roman general Pompey the Great besieged Jerusalem, entered the temple, and, in an act of theatrical audacity that shocked even many Romans, walked into the Holy of Holies to see what was there. He found nothing, no idol, no image, no treasure of gold. Not the most sacred space in the Jewish world was an empty room. He did not take anything. He did not desecrate it in the way Antiochus had, but his entry into that space was itself a kind of violation, a statement that no place, however holy, lay beyond the reach of Rome. Judea became a Roman client state, and eventually Jerusalem came under the rule of a man named Herod, the same Herod the Great who, according to Matthew 2, ordered the massacre of infant boys in Bethlehem, trying to kill the newborn king of the Jews. Herod was politically ruthless, personally paranoid, and architecturally brilliant. He expanded the Second Temple complex into one of the most magnificent building projects of the ancient world, doubling the size of the Temple Mount by constructing a massive retaining wall platform, much of which still stands today. See, the Western Wall, the Kotel, the most sacred site in contemporary Judaism, is the remnant of that Herodian retaining wall. The temple itself, rebuilt and expanded by Herod's engineers, was declared one of the wonders of the ancient world, a building so magnificent that when Jesus' disciples marveled at it, in Mark 13:1 saying, "Look, teacher, what massive stones, what magnificent buildings," their awe was not naive. The stones they were looking at weighed hundreds of tons. Into this Jerusalem, a city under Roman occupation, governed by a series of increasingly dysfunctional Roman prefects, seething with revolutionary movements and messianic expectation, bristling with the tension between religious purity and political compromise, walked Jesus of Nazareth. His entry into Jerusalem on what Christians call Palm Sunday is recorded in all 4 Gospels. He rode a donkey, deliberately fulfilling the prophecy of Zechariah 9:9, which said that the King of Zion would come gentle and riding on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey. The crowd spread their cloaks on the road and waved palm branches and shouted, "Hosanna," a Hebrew word meaning, "Save us now." They were shouting a prayer, not just a celebration. They wanted a deliverer. They expected a military king in the tradition of Judas Maccabeus, a man who would drive out the Romans and restore the kingdom of David. They got something they did not expect at all. Jesus wept over Jerusalem. Luke 19:41-44 records him stopping on the descent from the Mount of Olives, looking out over the city he was riding toward and weeping. Not tears of sentiment, tears of anguish, he said, "If you, even you, had only known on this day what would bring you peace, but now it is hidden from your eyes. The days will come upon you when your enemies will build an embankment against you and encircle you and hem you in on every side. They will dash you to the ground, you and the children within your walls. They will not leave one stone on another, because you did not recognize the time of God's coming to you. He was predicting the destruction of the city in specific, verifiable detail: an embankment, an encirclement, total destruction, not one stone left on another. 37 years later, every word came true. In the week that followed, Jesus overturned the money changers' tables in the temple complex, an action that the high priestly establishment could not ignore and could not forgive. He taught daily in the temple courts, debating the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the scribes with an authority that left them speechless and furious. He predicted the destruction of the temple itself in Matthew 24:2. Truly I tell you, not one stone here will be left on another. Every one will be thrown down. He was arrested in the Garden of Gethsemane on the night of Passover, tried before the Sanhedrin on charges of blasphemy, taken to the Roman prefect Pontius Pilate on charges that Pilate himself found unconvincing, and executed by crucifixion on a hill called Golgotha, the place of the skull, just outside the city walls. The crucifixion of Jesus is the single most documented event of ancient history in terms of subsequent historical influence. Whether one is a Christian or not, the fact is that the death and reported resurrection of a Galilean preacher in Jerusalem around 30 CE changed the course of human civilization in ways that are still unfolding today. Within 30 years, communities confessing that this executed man had risen from the dead and was Lord of the universe had spread from Jerusalem to Rome. Within 300 years, the Roman Empire that had crucified him had adopted his name as its official religion. But before any of that, Jerusalem burned again. The Jewish revolt against Rome began in 66 CE, fueled by decades of Roman misrule, corruption, and a series of incidents that finally pushed a patience-exhausted Jewish population past the breaking point. The Roman Emperor Nero sent his general Vespasian to crush the rebellion, and Vespasian began a systematic campaign through Galilee and Judea. When Nero died and Vespasian became emperor, he left his son Titus to finish the job. Titus besieged Jerusalem in the spring of 70 CE. The siege lasted 5 months. It was, by any measure, one of the most catastrophic episodes of urban destruction in the ancient world. The Jewish historian Josephus, who had been a commander in the revolt, switched sides and served with the Romans, and wrote a detailed account of the siege in his work, The Jewish War. His numbers, he claims over 1 million people died and nearly 100,000 were taken captive, are almost certainly exaggerated, as was common in ancient historical writing. But the core reality is confirmed by archaeology and multiple sources. The slaughter was enormous, the starvation was appalling, the city was completely destroyed, and the temple, the magnificent Herodian temple that Josephus himself called one of the most beautiful buildings in the world, was burned. The Romans did not intend to burn it, according to Josephus. Titus wanted it preserved as a trophy, but in the chaos of the final assault, a soldier threw a burning torch through a window into one of the temple's side rooms, and the fire spread, and the gold overlay melted into the stone cracks, and the soldiers pried apart every stone to get the gold, fulfilling in one terrible afternoon the prophecy that not one stone would be left on another. The Temple Mount was left bare. The city was leveled. The survivors were sold into slavery or sent to gladiatorial arenas across the empire. Titus returned to Rome in triumph, carrying the great menorah from the temple. Its image, carved into the Arch of Titus in Rome, still stands today. You can go and see it. The 7-branched lampstand, captured from Jerusalem, frozen in marble in the eternal city of its conquerors. But Jerusalem was not finished. The Emperor Hadrian, in 135 CE, following another Jewish revolt led by Bar Kokhba, decided to end Jerusalem's existence entirely. He demolished what remained, plowed the ground, built a new Roman city on the site called Aelia Capitolica, renamed the province Syria Palestina to erase the name Judea, and erected a temple to Jupiter on the site of the Jewish temple. Jews were banned from the city entirely on pain of death. They allowed to enter only once a year on the anniversary of the temple's destruction to weep at the ruins, a practice that may be the origin of what we now call the Wailing Wall, the Western Wall, as a site of Jewish mourning and prayer. Then Constantine became emperor of Rome in the 4th century, converted to Christianity, and his mother Helena made a pilgrimage to Jerusalem to identify the holy sites. The city began to be rebuilt as a Christian city. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre, built over the site identified as both Golgotha and the empty tomb of Jesus, was consecrated in 335 CE. Jerusalem became a Christian city. Pilgrims came from across the empire. Churches rose on every identified holy site. The olive-covered Mount of Olives became thick with monasteries. The city hummed with the prayers of a new faith. And then, in the 7th century, everything changed again. The armies of the Islamic Caliphate, energized by the new faith proclaimed by the Prophet Muhammad, swept out of Arabia with a speed and force that stunned the Byzantine Empire. Jerusalem, which had already been temporarily conquered by the Persians in 614 CE, in a catastrophic siege that burned many of the Christian churches, was now besieged by the Muslim forces under Caliph Umar ibn al-Khattab. In 637 CE, the Byzantine Patriarch Sophronius surrendered the city on the condition that Caliph Umar himself come to accept the surrender in person, which he did. Umar arrived in Jerusalem riding a camel, wearing simple clothes, and was escorted to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre by the Patriarch. When the time for Muslim prayer arrived, the Patriarch invited him to pray inside the church. Umar declined, politely but firmly. He said that if he prayed there, his followers would turn it into a mosque. He prayed outside instead, on the steps. It is a moment of remarkable religious statesmanship that has been celebrated across centuries of Islamic tradition. The Dome of the Rock, one of the most recognizable structures on the Jerusalem skyline today, its golden dome rising above the Temple Mount in a way that has defined the city's silhouette for 1,400 years, was built between 688 and 692 CE under the Umayyad Caliph Abd al-Malik. It was built over the exposed bedrock of Mount Moriah itself, the same rock, according to Jewish tradition, where Abraham prepared to sacrifice Isaac, the same rock, according to Islamic tradition, from which the Prophet Muhammad ascended to heaven during the night journey described in the Quran. The rock connects three great traditions in a single stone. Jerusalem was now held by three faiths at once. The tension of that shared claiming would never fully resolve. It still has not. The Crusades erupted in the 11th century when Pope Urban II called for Christian armies to retake the Holy Land. The First Crusade captured Jerusalem in 1099 in a siege that ended in a massacre. Contemporary accounts describe the soldiers wading through blood in the Temple Mount area, and while the exact numbers are debated, the brutality was not. The city was held by the Crusader Kingdom of Jerusalem for nearly a century before Saladin, the great Muslim general and leader of the Ayyubid dynasty, retook it in 1187 after his victory at the Battle of Hattin. Unlike the Crusaders, Saladin permitted the city's Christian population to leave peacefully. The contrast in conduct between the two conquests was noted by contemporaries and has been debated ever since. Centuries more passed. Mamluks, Ottomans, British Mandate, and finally, in 1948, the establishment of the modern state of Israel, and the wars that followed. In 1967, during the Six-Day War, Israeli forces captured the old city of Jerusalem, and Defense Minister Moshe Dayan stood at the Western Wall and said, "We have returned to our holiest of holy places, never to depart again." The question of Jerusalem's final status, who controls what, who prays where, whose sovereignty is recognized over which quarter of which city, remains one of the most intractable political questions on earth. But none of those political negotiations can fully account for why this city matters so deeply to so many people. The political stakes are real and must not be dismissed, but underneath them runs something older and more fundamental, a conviction shared across three great traditions and billions of human hearts that this particular hill was chosen, that something happened here that cannot be undone, that the stones remember 3,000 years of history, multiple empires, more sieges than any city should be asked to survive, more prayers spoken over its stones than any human calculator could count, more tears shed in its streets, more blood spilled on its ground, more hope placed in its future than any ordinary city of limestone and cedar and mortar could possibly deserve. And yet Jerusalem endures. There is a word that appears hundreds of times in the Hebrew scriptures in connection with Jerusalem, the word shalom, peace. But the city's very name reaches back through layers of etymology to that word. But the name itself has always been understood to promise what the city has so rarely delivered and what it has never stopped representing as a possibility, a city of peace. Not just the absence of war, but the Hebrew fullness of shalom, wholeness, completeness, right relationship, restoration, the world as it was meant to be. Every tradition that has loved Jerusalem has understood it as pointing towards something beyond itself. The prophets of Israel spoke of a day when the nations would stream to the mountain of the Lord's temple, and he would teach them his ways, and they would beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Isaiah wrote those words in Isaiah 2:2-4, and Micah echoed them almost word for word in Micah 4:1-3. They were not describing the Jerusalem of their own day. They were describing something coming, something the present had not yet managed to reach. The New Testament author of Revelation, writing in the final decade of the first century, saw a new city descending from heaven, the New Jerusalem, described in Revelation 21:2-4 as the holy city, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride beautifully dressed for her husband. And a voice declared, "God's dwelling place is now among the people, and he will dwell with them. He will wipe every tear from their eyes. There will be no more death or mourning or crying or pain, for the old order of things has passed away." The old Jerusalem, the earthly Jerusalem, has carried a weight of longing that no earthly city can fully bear. Every conqueror who marched his armies toward its gates was, in some sense, reaching for something that cannot be taken by force. And every worshiper who has ever stood at the Western Wall, or knelt in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, or raised their hands in prayer at the Dome of the Rock, has been doing the same thing, reaching towards something they know in their bones is real, even when they cannot fully explain why this particular hill is where they feel it most. Jerusalem has been destroyed and rebuilt, abandoned and found again. It has been a city of exile and a city of homecoming, a city that has driven its most devoted lovers to war and brought them to their knees in prayer. Psalm 122:6 says, "Pray for the peace of Jerusalem. May those who love you be secure." To pray for the peace of Jerusalem is not merely a political act, but it is a spiritual posture, aligning yourself with the longest, deepest longing in human history, the longing for the world to finally be set right, for the divided to be reconciled, for the broken to be whole. The story of Jerusalem is not finished. It was not finished when Nebuchadnezzar burned it. It was not finished when Titus leveled it. It is not finished today. And through every siege and every silence, every fire and every unanswered prayer, this city has survived, not merely as real estate, as a promise, as a place where the boundary between the earthly and the eternal has always seemed somehow thinner than anywhere else on earth. And now I want to stop and ask you something, and I mean this genuinely, not as a formality. Of everything we walk through today, David dancing before the ark, yet the priests unable to stand when the glory of God filled Solomon's temple, Jeremiah sitting in the ruins of everything he loved, the exiles weeping by the rivers of Babylon, Jesus stopping on the Mount of Olives and weeping over the city he was riding toward, the survivors of 1967 pressing their hands against the Western Wall for the first time in a generation. Which moment got to you? Which moment made you stop? Which moment felt less like ancient history and more like something you personally needed to hear today? Write it in the comments right now. Just one moment, one word, one sentence, whatever comes to you. I read every single comment on this channel, and I genuinely want to know which part of Jerusalem's story is still echoing inside you after this video ends. If this journey through 3,000 years of the most contested city on earth moved you even a fraction of how it moves me every time I go deep into it, please subscribe and hit the notification bell. We are just getting started. These stories are unlike anything else, and we are going to keep telling them together. Jerusalem has been standing for 3,000 years, and maybe, just maybe, it is still pointing us towards something we have not yet fully seen. We keep walking toward it.